with every generation that has passed us by.
Long live the cause of freedom.
And every event that has shaped who we are, comes the awareness that history lives in all of us. Pick a time, choose a place, and escape to where the past comes alive.
Mine eyes have seen the glory.
The History Channel.
Hello, I'm David McCullough. Welcome to the History Channel's special presentation of America's Most Endangered. In this hour, we present the National Trust for Historic Preservation's 1996 list of the most endangered sites in our country. The Trust is a nonprofit organization based in Washington, D.C., dedicated to the preservation of our historic American landmarks. These aren't just any places. They're places with pasts, with histories, direct links to the way we once lived and our story as a people. Every year, more and more of historic America disappears, and when it's gone forever. That's the tragedy, but it need not happen. We'll look at 11 places which are on the verge of being destroyed, 11 of America's most endangered. When we think of our history and where it unfolded, images of Gettysburg or the Alamo or maybe Monticello come to mind. They have all been preserved. But would the architectural masterpiece of Monticello still stand if Thomas Jefferson had not lived there? Would the hallowed fields at Gettysburg have been spared commercial development if so much history hadn't happened there? Throughout America, there are countless other places which, though not as well known, have nonetheless great historic importance. Here in southern Maryland, on the Patuxent River, is Sotterley Plantation. It's older than the country, built before Mount Vernon or Monticello, and tells the story, as you will hear, of Americans both black and white. This is an authentic American treasure, almost exactly as it was from the beginning, here and intact until now. The stories of this and the other endangered places is not all history with a big H, which is exactly what makes Sotterley and the others so fascinating, so valuable. They take us inside a way of life, a time past that was as real as our own, and that we can still touch and learn from.
They grace these barren lands with understated beauty. Formed by the fusion of Native American and Spanish ideas, the Adobe Church has been for nearly 400 years the heart and soul of New Mexico's rural communities. A place where babies were baptized, couples married, and solace was found. Today, more than 360 Adobe churches dot the New Mexico landscape. The majority are located in the northern part of the state, near the cities of Santa Fe and Albuquerque. They have been part of this region for centuries. By 1626, more than 100 years before the birth of George Washington, 43 Adobe churches had already been built. As a group, they represent some of America's oldest architecture.
Most of the buildings that we work on are what we term earthen architecture. And that can mean coursed earthen walls where mud was simply puddled in one course and let dry and then another course laid on top. It can be the standard Adobe mud brick, the sun-dried brick, which are then laid up in mud mortar. So it is an architecture that grows out of the earth upon which it sits, and from that point of view is rather unique.
These earthen structures require continual care. For nearly 400 years, the members of the church took care of them. Church maintenance was an annual ritual. But today, the makeup of the rural communities has changed. As a result, many churches have been neglected.
Over the past half century, there's been a period of serious economic decline in northern New Mexico particularly. Younger people have had to leave the community to larger population centers to find employment. And this has left the communities with smaller and older populations that are less capable of doing the physical work of maintaining the church.
A decline in the population isn't the only threat. The harsh desert elements have also taken their toll. In the 1950s, many churches were sealed in concrete in an attempt to preserve them, but the results were disastrous. The concrete sealed in moisture and destroyed the adobe it was intended to protect. Because of the climate, the changes in demographics, and the concrete, 126 adobe churches are now in imminent danger. The Roman Catholic Church owns the churches and works with a group called Cornerstones in an attempt to save them. The nonprofit group advises and assists communities hoping to restore their churches.
Many of the projects take 2 to 5 years, some have even taken longer, and it's dedication of the community every Saturday for every summer until the project's done, and quite often it's highly labor-intensive work.
Despite their efforts, there are simply too many endangered churches, but work continues. One such attempt is underway at a church in Arroyo Seco, a community just north of Taos. This particular church is relatively new, built in 1834. The last Mass was held in 1961. The residents hope to someday rejoice and worship within these adobe walls. And so they chisel away at the concrete on the outside of the church, pulling it off in sections to determine the exact amount of damage to the church. The moisture which was trapped by the concrete has eroded away major chunks of adobe. A great deal of work lies ahead. But it's a labor of love for these residents.
I've always told myself if I want to die, I want to die right here by this church, and go to heaven right through this church, because I love this church so much. And I always look out my window and I see this church, and I always remember that God's right here.
Tragically, a strong commitment is not enough. Restoration efforts have saved but 40 churches in New Mexico. More than 100 are on the verge of collapse. It is a tragic fate for the church, its community, and our history.
We live in a desert area, the high desert, and we're always looking for shade, in the desert. And a church, any church, is a shade tree that everybody can get under. And when that church falls apart and is gone, it's one less shade tree.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt once insightfully noted, "There is nothing so American as our national parks." The fundamental idea behind the parks is that the country belongs to the people. Today, 51 national parks in 25 states encompass more than 80 million acres of our most cherished natural resources. Their spectacular natural beauty is the big story. The lesser-known story is that our national parks provide sanctuary for more than 20,000 historic structures. Tragically, hundreds are on the verge of being lost. 2 examples can be found at Glacier National Park. Glacier National Park in northwestern Montana is more than 1 million acres of magnificent peaks and pristine alpine meadows. Shortly after the park was formed, 9 alpine chalets were built by the Great Northern Railway. The railway hoped the chalets would lure visitors to Glacier, and indeed they did. For 7 decades, the chalet's appeal helped sustain tourism and allowed thousands of people to discover Glacier National Park. Unfortunately, the remoteness of the chalets also meant it was difficult to maintain them, and it was a lack of maintenance that led to their downfall. Today, only 2 chalets still stand, and for the past 4 years, they've been closed. Closed because they need new water and sewage systems, and the Park Service simply doesn't have the money. The Western Regional Office is responsible for 5,000 historic structures. Its annual budget is just $1.5 million. The price tag to fix the chalets alone, $1.2 million.
People come to the parks for different purposes, and obviously we have great natural parks that do attract and should attract many people. But the historic structures that are there are also part of that park, and they're part of the history of those parks, and they belong there, and they deserve to be maintained and enjoyed, because a lot of people really care about those buildings, and we simply have to find the means to care for them.
The National Park Service has a tradition of just getting along and not complaining and saluting and doing your work. Trouble with that is that unless you kick and scream and yell, this place is falling apart. There's no reason for our fellow citizens to know that they are. In the instance of the chalets at Glacier, they've been deteriorating for years. And it's just by saying, hey, wait a minute here, this has gone so far that we're going to leave a permanent scar on the landscape if we don't fix them, that we stop saying, oh, we'll do our best. And we say to everybody else, wait a minute, you have to do your best too.
This is Sotterley Plantation, a one-time tobacco plantation in continuous use since 1717. Set on 36 acres along the banks of the Patuxent River in southern Maryland, Sotterley boasts a Tidewater-styled manor house and a collection of antebellum outbuildings. It is one of these outbuildings that separates this plantation from virtually all others. It has a surviving slave cabin. Built in 1830, the cabin is one of the last standing slave quarters in America. The lessons learned from this structure alone are invaluable. This one-room, dirt floor cabin, 12 by 12, housed a man, his wife, and their 17 children. But Sotterley Plantation and all it represents is in dire need of repair. Sadly, the annual $200,000 operating budget to maintain Sotterley and its surroundings has been drastically reduced. As a result, visitations have been limited to just 2 days a week. The battle for Sotterley's preservation is costly. Despite the opulent appearance of the manor house, it needs $1.2 million in restoration work. And the slave cabin, a powerful reminder of a tragic era, needs $63,000 in repairs. Today, a special preservation effort is happening at Sotterley. The descendant of a slave and the descendant of the man who owned that slave are working together.
It's rather interesting. As president of this board, I serve as president, having an ancestor who owned slaves, and I serve with honor and with the pleasure of a woman whose great-grandparents were slaves, and they happen to be descendants of my great-grandfather's workforce. So we find it historical and interesting, and a fact of life we both appreciate from our different perspectives.
I think that the value to the coming generations, the generations that are not even born yet, I think that cabin and that's the mansion, the whole plantation is a credit to the history of St. Mary's County.
The lessons to be learned at Sotterley Plantation touch both black and white. Today, both races are working together to preserve them, so the stories are not forgotten.
I think all of it's personal. It's not only personal to me, it's personal to blacks and whites. I think they should all look at history in a wider view than they have been in the past. Because saving Sotterley, not only the slave cabin, that entire plantation tells you what happened 200 years ago. And embarrassed as it might be, you cannot change it. It's the truth. And you look at it realistically, square in the face, and deal with it.
With the end of the Civil War, a new and very different kind of America came into its own as the growth of our industrial strength, mills, foundries, railroads, transformed the whole look and tempo of the nation.
In the 1840s and 50s, the foothills of California bustled with promise. The lure of gold, copper, and other treasures sent men to California in droves. The dreams of hitting the next motherlode created a frenzied atmosphere throughout the West. The Knight Foundry in Sutter Creek, California, 50 miles southeast of Sacramento, benefited from the activity. The tools and machinery needed to make the mining possible, everything from water wheels to locomotive parts, were crafted here. Beginning in 1873, the Knight Foundry turned out the cast iron gears, sprockets, hoists, and wheels that helped keep the gold mines operating, as well as the production of California's lumber mills. hundreds of items were created from raw iron, infernal heat, and know-how.
The jobs that were available here, though, before the turn of the century were very high-tech, very highly skilled people, and many of the people would have considered themselves well up in the community. They weren't hard rock miners down in the ground all day. They had good skills, and they were proud of the jobs that they were doing. Knight Foundry is an example of late 1800s manufacturing. It's the last water-powered foundry and machine shop in the United States, as far as we know. And it continues to produce cast iron castings the way it was done at the turn of the century.
Ed Arata has envisioned a preservation effort combining foundry work and tourist dollars. But during the last few years, economic changes have quieted activity at the foundry. Consequently, the current owner has a price tag on it, $575,000. If sold to an insensitive buyer, the foundry could be dismantled for scrap. Individually, the various pieces of the foundry seem worthless, but their collective worth serves as an industrial monument, showcasing the technological advancements made 125 years ago.
This place is historically significant because of the water power devices that are produced. Those devices or those styles of water wheels are still used worldwide today. We'll lose a connection to our industrial past, how people produce things, and the pride and the craftsmanship that people put into their work.
In 1873, President James A. Garfield told an audience at Hudson College in New York, "The railway is the greatest centralizing force of modern times." That same year, the first tracks of the East Broad Top Railroad were laid 40 miles southeast of Altoona, Pennsylvania. The main line ran for 30 miles and connected small towns like Orbisonia, Saltillo, and Robertsdale with passenger and mail service. The railroad also provided the means to transport the region's local resources of coal, iron, and limestone. Soon, the hills of south central Pennsylvania echoed with the sounds of industry and commerce. The East Broad Top Railroad had brought vitality to a once dormant part of America.
Contemporary railroading is not what East Broad Top is about. It's not about how you can get trains a mile long with enormous engines whistling across the plain. It's about an earlier time in which lots of Americans came out of rural isolation, and because there were these rails that stretched for 5,000 miles of a single ribbon of metal, the country got knitted together.
The glory years at East Broad Top ended with the Depression of the 1930s. Unable to make a profit for a number of years, the railroad finally shut down in 1956. In May of that same year, the Kowalczyk Salvage Company bought East Broad Top. And for the past 40 years, the company has kept it alive with nostalgic weekend runs for tourists during the summer months. But that has become too costly. The company can no longer afford to subsidize operations.
Now boarding on track number 2, train 1, the 9:30 a.m. local passenger train bound for Black.
The state of Pennsylvania is considering a $30 million industrial development bond to acquire and restore the railroad. The bond, coupled with a private partnership, is perhaps the only way to save this historic, intact railroad system.
East Broad Top in Pennsylvania, it's a whole railroad system altogether. In a way that you couldn't find anywhere else in the country today. And it's still operating, it's functional as a museum, but very much in need of support, public and private support, because it speaks more eloquently to what American industry was at that point in history than anything you could ever see on a written page. And that really is why preservation is important.
The Roaring '20s were the era in which the grand movie palaces were born. In 1922, some 40 million people filed into theaters each week across America. 7 years later, that figure had doubled. On August 8, 1925, opening day at Chicago's Uptown Theater, crowds gathered before noon. By 2 o'clock, 60 policemen were called in to handle the estimated crowd of 12,000 waiting for the second show. On that day, the marquee boasted one of the great art buildings of the world, an acre of seats in a magic city. Today, the magic has been replaced with memories. Many of the memories come from those who grew up nearby and spent their weekends here.
They used to have organ pipe music here. It's like going to church. You felt so good. In fact, I don't even like television that much for a movie because you don't have the size, And these old places have the size and wonderful place.
The 4,300-seat auditorium, combined with the 3 lobbies, made the Uptown the largest movie palace in the country. The architectural style of the Uptown Theater, called Spanish Baroque, was the vision of Chicago architects Rapp and Rapp.
They were known for their French style of architecture, and this really was kind of a Spanish heraldry, is the best way to describe it. Throughout the building, you will see all kinds of symbolism of the heraldry, the shields, the lions, the griffins, etc. And it was really quite successful architecturally.
Architecturally magnificent and built on a grand scale, the Uptown provided an atmosphere unmatched.
One of the things that people appreciate when they get to see a movie in a place like this is quality of sound, the scale of the picture, and the ambience of being with others entertained. The other purpose of this building originally, and would play again, is if in fact you're not pleased with the entertainment, you might be entertained by the architecture. The architects certainly had that in mind when they made this so palatial.
But a building so palatial costs a kingly sum to maintain. By 1981, it cost almost $500,000 a year just to open the doors. So, the Uptown closed them. And since it is sat empty and maintenance has been deferred, the price of preserving it has gone up. Today, the Uptown Theater needs $10 million in renovations to return to its original splendor. And like many other dying grand theaters, it needs interest. Patrons who want to be entertained in a palace-like setting.
If they could rejuvenate this, I would come here every week just to support it. We've got so many beautiful theaters that just went down because nobody cared. Now they have all the mega malls bringing up movie theaters, and it's not the same. No, it's not the same.
In the beginning of the century, America's quest for leisure activities wasn't limited to the movies. The 20s were also marked by the growth of another leisure time pursuit, the summer vacation. Throughout the Northeast, seaside and lakeside resorts in the Catskills of New York, the Poconos of Pennsylvania, and along the New England seaboard were born. One of the finest was Newcastle, New Hampshire's Wentworth by the Sea. She has been called the Grand Dam by the Sea, a part of the landscape for more than a century. Construction on the hotel began in 1874. The Wentworth was one of the first resorts in the nation to cater to both upper and middle classes. It came complete with tennis courts, a golf course, a boat dock, and a saltwater pool. This grand hotel also played a defining role in international affairs. In 1904, President Theodore Roosevelt brokered peace with both sides of the Russo-Japanese War. Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and its naval shipyard was chosen for the talks. The nearby Wentworth Hotel was picked for the accommodations.
They were here for 30 days. They arrived by boat. Again, they were supposed to negotiate directly between themselves. They would formally negotiate at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, and they would take a boat from Wentworth by the Sea, or sometimes by car, sometimes by horse-drawn cart, but primarily by boat. They'd go to Wentworth, they'd go to the shipyard, and negotiate formally. But that was, once, twice, three times a week. The rest of the time, they were either at the hotel or with local people. This hotel is a landmark to peace.
As a result of the negotiations, a treaty to end the war was signed on September 5, 1905, and Roosevelt won the Nobel Peace Prize, the first president ever to receive the coveted honor. As for the Wentworth, the negotiations may be the key to its survival. Many Japanese and Japanese Americans have a special interest in preserving it.
The easy way to illustrate that would be to compare to a situation, let's say a developer would propose to build a condominium development, let's say, on the battleground of Gettysburg. Now, how would you as an American feel? And that's the same kind of feeling that that the Japanese would feel when they hear that this building might be torn down.
Wentworth's history is not just political. At one time, the resort attracted guests that included film star Gloria Swanson and cowgirl Annie Oakley. To ensure that celebrities and regular guests enjoyed their stay, the Wentworth employed more people than there were guests, as many as 325. One of them was Wadley Woods. He began teaching tennis here back in 1946.
This was a very active area here. Tennis court over here. One down just over the hill there, four different ones. A beautiful putting green here, which was busy all the time.
With advances in transportation, family vacations headed in new directions. The once vibrant Wentworth by the Sea began to slow. After decades of declining business, the Wentworth closed in 1981. In the late 1980s, large sections of the hotel were torn down, reducing it from 300 rooms to just over 100 rooms. The demolition of the hotel was particularly sad for those who remembered a better era.
Well, I think of all the lovely times I had there, and nice people that I met, and oh, it's so sad to see it. Just standing there, no activity. It's just sad. And when they tore down most of it, that was devastating, really.
Wentworth by the Sea is currently owned by the Green Company, a development company that has the property up for sale. The asking price for the hotel and 4.5 acres of oceanfront property is $1 million. The Wentworth has until October to find a new owner. It is likely to be her last attempt to preserve a history which represents a playful time in America and retells an international event.
Just because the era has gone by doesn't mean the building should be disposed of. It doesn't mean that its life is gone. I mean, it's ready for another stage in its life. I mean, I think when you walk around the property and you look out the windows, you can really literally hear the people there. You can see people playing tennis. You can imagine women walking around with parasols back in the 20s and the teens. I mean, you just get the whole sense that there's so many lives that have been affected by this and connected to this, and that in some ways, they're all lost a little bit when that happens.
Today, everywhere, Americans are rediscovering the appeal of our small towns, the different pace, where familiar faces and familiar streets define a feeling of neighborhood. Once, most of America lived in small towns. Small town life is all through our literature, our movies, the songs we sing. Small town main streets speak to us of the character of American life past and more of American life present. But in some places, the very popularity of small town life is a threat to that life, and holding on to those qualities that are at the heart of the appeal is increasingly the challenge.
For its 6,500 residents and thousands of vacationers, primarily from Detroit and Chicago, Petoskey, Michigan offered a quaint and beautiful setting not readily found in the big city. Perched on the Little Traverse Bay in the northwestern part of Michigan's Lower Peninsula, Petoskey was recently named one of the 100 best small towns in America by writer Norm Crampton. Surrounding the town are working farms, woodlands, hills, and lakes. But the rolling countryside encompassing this town is being threatened by a preservation issue known as sprawl.
This is really the unplanned development in all directions, commercial, residential, highways, in ways that destroy historic communities or stable communities of any kinds. And Petoskey, Michigan is a good example of this, where they're not just being threatened, its core downtown business area is being threatened by a huge new shopping complex outside. that will exceed the capacity of the entire downtown. And this will suck the economic life out of the downtown and threaten its viability.
A development of this magnitude and the same big box kind of retailing that we see all over America tends to homogenize the visual landscape of the country. And why should Petoskey look like anywhere else USA? You know, we would like to try to retain the small town unique charm that we have.
Businesses in Petoskey's downtown are battling proposed retail sprawl, and this is not the only threat. $28 million in federal money has been approved to build a bypass around the city. According to a state survey, the bypass will serve only about 13% of motorists and destroy 900 acres of dairy farmland.
If you don't have as much land to farm, you can't have as many animals, and there's no way that there's no land left to buy in this particular area. So you would either have to be a lot smaller and have less animals, or you'd have to start selling the land to make up the income that you lost on your animals.
The last of the sprawling threats in Petoskey, Michigan, is residential construction. Preservationists say that, ironically, the reasons that make Petoskey one of the best small towns in America are the same ones that threaten its future.
I think the more people are starting to realize that you have to save something for the future. And I hope we can agree on something here that would surely be better than wasting all this farmland and open space that we have around Petoskey.
The Hudson River Valley showcases an extraordinary concentration of national historic landmarks and romantic landscapes. But in the midst of this preservation success story is the struggling city of Newburgh. It is an impoverished town with a rich history. 40 years ago, Newburgh was an all-American city, one of the best places in the country to live.
The city of Newburgh was at one time the queen of the Hudson. It's a midpoint right in between New York City and Albany, and steamships would come up through the Hudson River and they'd stop here in Newburgh, and some of the more prominent families and prominent people would stay at the Palatine Hotel on Grand Street, which is no longer there. And it was a stop. It was a very important stop for some of the more prominent citizens of our country.
One reason they stopped was for the town's history. Newburgh was the site where General George Washington had his headquarters during the final year of the Revolutionary War. From this stone house, Washington kept an eye on the advancing British troops as they tried to make their way up the Hudson River. In the mid-19th century, Newburgh became an epicenter for the most prolific architecture and landscape designers in America. Newburgh's most famous son, Andrew Jackson Downing, designed the grounds around the U.S. Capitol and the White House. Working with Downing in Newburgh was renowned English architect Frederick Clark Withers, who designed this Newburgh church in 1857. The church is part of the East End Historic District, an intact concentration of more than 2,400 historic buildings within a 3-mile area. Collectively, these neighborhoods showcase 19 different architectural styles. Among the prominent men that created the district were Alexander Jackson Davis, the famous Gothic Revival architect who designed the exquisite Hudson Valley home Lyndhurst, and landscape designer Frederick Law Olmsted, who is best known for creating Central Park. For a town of just 26,000 people, Newburgh has a wealth of history. It also has an incredible amount of poverty. Over the past 4 decades, unemployment and a shrinking industrial tax base have plagued the city and its residents, creating an economic ghost town, a problem for many cities in the Northeast.
Newburgh is a very poor community. Over the years, it's seen a lot of devastation. We have 41% of the county's welfare population, so that our problems with people in need of services is great.
The abandoned buildings and dilapidated homes in Newburgh's historic district provide a dilemma for preservationists. How do you rebuild a whole economy and restore an historic town with no money? And how do you ensure all residents participate in the revitalization process?
Kev, this should be ready.
A few small investments in Newburgh's economy are beginning to add up. Across from Washington's headquarters, a row of shops has moved into the vacant storefronts. But this is just a beginning. Much more needs to be done, And the most important aspect in preserving Newburgh is getting the town's less fortunate residents involved in preservation.
We think this is an example of where community revitalization can bring forces and energies and resources to bear to make this a viable community again, a wonderful community again, using preservation as a tool for revitalization. It could be a very exciting opportunity.
If Harry Truman were to come back to his hometown of Independence, Missouri, he might not recognize it. Urban development has drastically changed it. Nicknamed the Queen of the Trails, for it was the starting point of the Santa Fe, California, and Oregon trails, Independence, Missouri is best known as the home of our nation's 33rd president. Many believe it is the address on Delaware Street, not Pennsylvania Avenue, where Harry Truman is best remembered. For more than 50 years, Truman and his wife Bess lived here. The former president was a man of the people, and he lived his life that way. To know the man, one needs to come to his town, to walk his streets, to see his neighborhood.
He walked the neighborhood a lot because he loved the neighborhood. He loved the people that he lived next to for many, many years, and one of his favorite things, not only to get exercise, but also because he liked to do it, was to talk to the people along the way. Basically, they were his neighbors, his friends, people that he'd been associated with for 50, 60 years.
Sue Gentry has been a columnist for the Independence Examiner since 1929. When she first went to work for the paper, Harry Truman was a local judge.
He was very, very pleasant. He always smiled, and he was so courteous, and he was always very nice to me. I know when I would try to get stories, he would make me feel that my story that I wanted was as important as any of those New York newspapermen.
In 1972, an historic district was established with the aim of protecting Truman's neighborhood. In 5 years, the district tripled in size. Then, in 1984, city leaders decided to cut the historic district back by 2/3, leaving much of the area near the Truman property unprotected. The Victorian house on Delaware Street is not endangered, but much of the surrounding neighborhood is. Located 1 block from the Truman home, the First Baptist Church has been part of the preservation issue. This active church has been an important part of Independence for more than 150 years. In the 1960s, the church began buying surrounding property to meet the needs of a growing congregation, and in so doing, became embroiled in a preservation debate.
I think we have anchored the historic district. While a lot of the buildings around us were decaying and people have all kinds of problems there, we built buildings that invested $3.5 million 10 years ago, and now are preserving an old building that was a historic landmark in this district area. And if we had abandoned that, who would have taken care of it? I think we are contributing significantly to preserving this area and stabilizing it and making growth possible.
First Baptist Church is one of many churches in the area to acquire property to meet their expanding needs. One of the largest property owners in Independence is the Reorganized Church of Latter-day Saints. At a cost of $35 million, the church recently built its world headquarters in Independence. The modern structure is visible from the courthouse square and throughout the historic district. The Reorganized Church of Latter-day Saints is also in the process of bulldozing dozens of homes on the surrounding streets to create a scenic vista around its new headquarters. As a result of this growth, some homeowners are concerned.
I've been a lover of history all my life and came from a different part of the country and couldn't imagine that we don't preserve history out here in the way that other places do, and that we don't revere it and we don't share it for, future generations. And, so I'm committed to the fight, I suppose, because I just think it's so important. As a child, I remember the love of history and learning about it and want to see, children have that opportunity.
While churches in Harry Truman's hometown attempt to grow, there's the issue of preserving the neighborhood. And both proponents are counting Harry on their side.
He was always for history. He was always for preserving things.
Our church, very friendly with Mr. Truman. Mr. Truman, very friendly to our church. I think Harry would have supported us to the hilt.
What if in 50 or 100 years from now or longer, we didn't retain that 50s, 60s, and 70s time period to represent what it was like for an American president to come home and retire to? And of course, the home and the grounds might still be here, but what would it look like around us? Would it be high-rise buildings like downtown New York with a little historic building retained? And that's part of our culture, it's part of our heritage, and something that we feel strongly about preserving, and there are a lot of others that do too.
The year was 1957. Former World War II General, then President Dwight D. Eisenhower, was forced to wage war against an old enemy, prejudice. Eisenhower sent 1,000 U.S. Army soldiers to Little Rock, Arkansas's Central High School to enforce the law. On the morning of September 27, 1957, 9 black students challenged the validity of the 14th Amendment by simply trying to go to school.
The first day, we didn't get in. We were barred from entrance into the schools. The second day that we went back in was the day that the mob outside the school practically broke through the police barrier. The third day that I finally went to school, I went to school with the 101st Airborne Division and the Army. That was my beginning of my senior year at Little Rock Central High School.
On that eventful September morning, integration was also very traumatic for white students. Robin Laux remembers the ramifications of sharing her textbook with new student Terrence Roberts.
Teacher called the class to order and gave us a page to open to. I realized that he didn't have his book and needed it, so I got up and pulled my desk across the aisle and opened the book and sat down beside him, and we shared it. I was followed home that afternoon, and I was spat on, and I had racial epithets yelled at me, which I ignored, and that started a series of incidences that lasted the rest of the year, in which I got many, many hate calls and many, many hate letters.
Nearly 40 years after Ernest Green and 8 others made their historic walk, Central High faces another test. This time, Central is receiving failing marks. A report card shows Central needs more than $6 million in repairs, money the school district does not have. Among the problems, a consultant study found repairs to the roof are needed. Classroom size is inadequate, and easier access to the school's 5 floors is needed for disabled students. If maintenance is not addressed quickly, the costs for repairs may soar, making it even more difficult to find necessary funding to save Central. Built nearly 70 years ago in 1927, Central was highly acclaimed as the most beautiful high school in America. In addition to its historical and architectural significance, Central High has remained a prestigious academic school. Today, more than 1,600 students attend.
I believe that we have one of the strongest high schools, not only in the state, but here in America. We offer more than 125 classes, of which we have approximately 12 advanced placement courses. We offer 6 foreign languages. Part of our school is an international magnet school. We have a strong speech debate program, strong music. We're just well-rounded in many aspects here at Central.
While the school has remained strong through its turbulent years, Central's neighborhood has suffered greatly.
There was white flight. When people in great numbers moved west, the city, not having additional new revenues, was spreading about the same amount of city income over a much wider area, which meant that there was less money to maintain infrastructure in the older areas.
Although Central's neighborhood has deteriorated considerably, a neighborhood association has captured the attention of city planners with plans to rebuild and preserve the area, as well as develop a Central High museum.
The visions that are in people's minds all across the world, if something happened to this building and it just went away,
I think that we would lose something tangible to help us memorialize what that 57 event really meant.
In 1957, many of Little Rock's 100,000 residents organized because of hatred. Today, residents are banding together to preserve a history lesson taught to the nation by 9 black students.
Little Rock Central High School is a piece of American history. I think Little Rock is a good learning tool for where people have to go to try to resolve conflicts and try to get everybody on the same page and see if you can go forward and not backwards. So, hey, if it's only $6 million, I'd say that's $6 million well spent.
There are the 1996 most endangered sites as selected by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. The list is a warning sign of what the nation stands to lose, and each of the 11 speaks to the larger issues at stake. But interest in and support for preservation of our historic treasures is on the rise everywhere. If you're interested in knowing how you can help, call the National Trust for Historic Preservation at 1-800-315-6847 or write Department HC 1785 Massachusetts Avenue Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036. Thank you for joining us. For the National Trust, I'm David McCullough.